Hello, this is Cameron Bagay, and this video is going to be a quick introduction to the 2021 Lincoln-Douglas March-April debate topic. Before we jump into the topic, I wanted to highlight a few resources that can provide you with some additional learning tools. The first of those resources is the DebateDrills Academy. At the DebateDrills Academy, you can find a ton of videos that talk about various topics in debate. Some of these are specific to LD, and some of these are broader. Whether you're interested in learning how to engage in high-level circuit debate or just looking for a quick introduction to LD, the DebateDrills Academy can help you out. Another resource is DebateDrills group and one-on-one coaching. Not only do we offer tutoring at DebateDrills, but we also offer various classes suited for different skill levels and different interest levels. Whether you want to do circuit or traditional LD, we have a class for you. So let's jump into the topic. Resolved. The United States ought to guarantee universal child care. Obviously, the first step in understanding a topic is figuring out what it's saying. So we're going to start with our definitions. United States, this is pretty self-explanatory. We all know what the US is. Ought to is a term that suggests a moral obligation. When people use the term ought to, they aren't just asking whether something has economic benefit, right? They're asking whether something is the right thing to do. It's important to bear in mind, though, that morality might mean something different for governments than it does for individuals. In other words, the United States, as a governmental entity, might have unique moral obligations that don't necessarily directly mirror the obligations of individuals. So as you're thinking about this part of the topic, what the obligations of the state are, make sure that your arguments are specific to the moral responsibilities of governments. Next term is guarantee. That means to ensure the availability of. Also, probably not a term that there's going to be a ton of debate about. However, universal child care is a term that is a little bit more complex. This basically describes when child care is made a public good. There are other public goods that can kind of serve as a model or example for what universal child care might look like. Things like roads, schools, and firefighting services are services provided by the government to the public at large. Everyone takes advantage of these, and these are funded via the government treasury. And there are different types of childcare. One type of childcare is when a provider comes into the child's home. So in that situation, you have a one-to-one ratio, one childcare provider to one child. There are also times when care is given in the provider's home. So when one or several children are taken care of in a child care provider's home. And finally, there is care that is provided in dedicated centers, specific spaces where you might have multiple child care providers and many different children. So now that we understand what the terms in the resolution are talking about, let's glance at the history and context of child care in the United States. In World War II, there was actually a government program that, while it didn't provide universal child care, did something kind of close. This specifically occurred in 1943, and the government allocated the present-day equivalent of $1 billion for a child care service. The thinking behind this was that many mothers were busy in the workforce because their husbands were off at war. And that meant that there weren't people to take care of children at home. This money was coming from the 1941 Lanham Act, which dedicated a large amount of funding to help with areas kind of adjacent to the war effort. However, despite all the money that went into this universal child care program, a lot of children still didn't see any benefit from this. The child care provisions, though expansive, were not truly universal. The program, though, was still very, very popular, and it was extended into 1946 because of public demand. Basically, When the federal government indicated that they were going to shut down the program, the public outcry was so loud that the government decided to extend the program further than it had originally planned. There's also something called the Comprehensive Childhood Development Act. Comprehensive Childhood Development Act. This passed with bipartisan support in the House and Senate in 1972. So sometime after World War II, and yet still quite a long time before present day, both the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans came together and decided that they wanted to provide more comprehensive protection and provision of child care. However, President Richard Nixon actually vetoed that bill. So even though it had bipartisan support, even though it passed both the House and the Senate, the president refused to sign the bill into law, and it didn't go anywhere. Now, why did President Richard Nixon veto the Comprehensive Childhood Development Act? In order to understand that, we need to place this contextually. 1972, what was going on during that time, and what were the public norms and attitudes? Well, one thing that was going on is the United States was, in a sense, fighting communism. And President Richard Nixon viewed the Comprehensive Childhood Development Act as something that was almost communist in nature. The idea that the government was going to provide a welfare service for everybody, to him, that sounded way too close to communism, and that's a large part of the reason why he vetoed it. But he also vetoed it for a different reason. He thought that the bill, by providing childcare outside of the home, in other words, making it easier for mothers to join the workforce and have their children taken care of by other people, he thought that that would actually run counter to family values. Now today, the idea that women have to be at home and can't be in the workforce and must be the ones who are taking care of their children 24/7, that seems pretty outdated. But in 1972, the president of our country felt so strongly about it that he actually vetoed this bill. Now today, we do have many different government child care programs that are meant to ease the burden on families with children. There's the child care tax credit. There's also child care subsidies. There are state pre-kindergarten programs, pre-K programs. There's also the Child Care and Development Block Grant. None of these programs, though, universally provide child care. They're meant to assist, not provide, in the provision of child care. So even with tax credits, which reduce your taxes, even with subsidies, which provide extra funding for families who have young children, even with state-provided pre-kindergarten, pre-K programs, and even with the Child Care and Development Block Grant, there are still a lot of gaps. There's also the Head Start program, which, just like the others, has those gaps. Kind of the key takeaway here is, yes, there are a lot of government programs that are designed to provide easier access to childcare, but none of those programs get us all of the way there. Access is still limited. 3 and 5 rural regions lack adequate care. And that's not even an issue of funding. Just 3 out of every 5 rural regions don't have a place where families can send their children to be taken care of, no matter what those families are willing to pay. Some estimates claim that childcare costs a typical family a third of its income, though, which means even if you're one of the lucky ones, even if you live in an area where there are available childcare programs, those programs are going to be very, very expensive. And that's something that politicians are waking up to. Multiple presidential candidates proposed childcare plans. This was one of the issues that was hotly debated during the presidential debates. Maybe not, on the grand stage in those very big presidential debates, but it was a very big part of the discussion surrounding which candidate was best. Now, obviously, President Biden was elected, and he was one of those candidates who had a plan. And he's putting that plan into action today, even though it's still in its very early fledgling steps. So what does President Biden's plan look like? Well, he's allocating a lot of funds, but most of those promised funds would go to childcare centers themselves. This is also related to the COVID situation right now. A lot of childcare centers are suffering, and that's part of the reason that President Biden's plan puts so much money into those childcare centers as opposed to families who need to actually pay for the childcare of their children. However, the plan also allocates $15 billion to an existing program that would help low-income families afford childcare. In other words, we have various programs right now that help low-income families provide childcare, and this plan that President Biden has proposed allocates $15 billion to those already existing programs. He's also making the tax credit more robust. And the way that works, to kind of oversimplify it, is if you're spending money on childcare, that means you don't have to pay as much in taxes. So, what are the affirmative arguments on this topic? Now that we have an understanding of kind of the context and history of this issue, what are various reasons that you might offer for why childcare should be guaranteed by the government? The first set of arguments is related to feminism, right? Failing to provide childcare reinforces anti-feminist notions of the dutiful housewife. President Nixon himself vetoed childcare because it had family-weakening implications. In other words, when we look at the history of the provision, or lack thereof, of childcare, what we see is this idea that mothers need to be in the home taking care of their children, that they shouldn't be out in the workforce, that they shouldn't have their own independent goals, right? That they can't support their family by working at a job, but rather have to support the family by staying home and taking care of children. That notion is terribly antiquated and problematic. And so one reason we might want to provide childcare, one reason we might want to guarantee it, is because that will allow women to more easily enter the workforce, and continuing to fail to provide childcare rests on this terrible bedrock of anti-feminist ideology. Another argument that you can make is one very related to the feminist argument and very much overlapping with it, and that's the argument of women employment, right? Increased childcare opportunities translates to more employed women. In other words, when women can't get childcare, when they don't have someplace to send children, they're forced to stay home and take care of the children themselves. But when there is a universal guarantee of childcare in the United States, those mothers can then go and join the workforce or pursue other goals. Women would benefit from that, right, in a very significant way, and the economy would also benefit. There's also an argument of independence here, that basically this would grant women more freedom financially and otherwise, and that's something that is very, very important. Another thing to note about this argument is that it's not necessarily tied to just women. Although women would probably see the most benefit in terms of increased employment opportunities as a result of universal childcare, there are also men who are the home takers and men who take care of their children at home. And this would give those men an opportunity to join the workforce as well. There's also an argument of discrimination. Currently, quality childcare is largely reserved to the wealthy. If you're living in a large city and you have a lot of money, childcare is not a huge issue for you. You have a lot of options. But for those of us who don't live in big cities, or those of us who don't have a lot of money, childcare is a problem. And so there's a disparate impact of a lack of quality childcare. It's not hitting the wealthy, it's hitting those who don't have as much money. There are socioeconomic and racial disparities in childcare availability. So if you look at the numbers, right, we see that those who suffer because childcare is not available, they happen to be more prominently found in certain socioeconomic and racial groups. Also, one argument you might want to make as the affirmative is that the cost of childcare, or rather the net cost of childcare, is actually not that severe. Some studies argue that childcare basically pays for itself, This is the argument that we were looking at earlier, right? That when childcare is available, you have more people who can enter the workforce. More people in the workforce means a more robust economy. And there's a very simple mathematic way to look at this. If one parent in every family needs to stay home to take care of their child, for every child, almost, you have one parent out of the workforce. But if you have universal child care centers, where you have maybe 5 children for every caretaker, that means you have an additional 4 people who are now able to enter the workforce. And the child care provider themselves, they're also part of that workforce. So that creates a boost to the economy, which then might offset the cost of childcare. Some people argue that childcare actually results in a net gain in revenue for the government because of those boosts to the economy. Now, obviously, this is a pretty empirical question, and if you want to engage in this debate, I encourage you to do some pretty nuanced research and find some strong studies that outline in numerical terms exactly how this might break down. One thing to note, though, is that this argument is largely defensive, right? If you're just arguing that childcare pays for itself or almost pays for itself, that's not necessarily a proactive reason why the government should guarantee universal childcare. It's just a reason why one of the potential drawbacks might not be as severe as one would first assume. Now, of course, if you argue that childcare actually results in a net gain in revenue for the government, then you have an offensive argument on your hands. One other thing to realize is that other countries actually serve as a model for universal childcare. Many countries, other than the United States, successfully implement childcare programs that have a lot of benefits. And looking at those other countries can provide some context for your arguments, but also some really strong empirics. In other words, because other countries have successfully implemented childcare programs, you don't need to debate in the world of abstraction. Your arguments don't need to be wholly theoretical. You can point to very specific success stories all around the world. Childcare, though, is even more necessary in the United States, right? If you look at many of these European countries that have successful childcare programs, a lot of them also have really robust protections for families with children. They have maternity leave, paternity leave, flexible work options, and extensive vacations. In the United States, we don't have those protections, at least not to that level. So looking to these other countries is really interesting because we see that they find it necessary to have childcare. And in the United States, today we don't have childcare, and yet we have an even greater need for free childcare because our jobs don't have as many protections for the people with families and with children. There's also a rights-based argument to be made, or rather several rights-based arguments to be made. Childcare, some claim, is a fundamental right like education or housing. In other words, you can take the stance that this isn't a debate about economics or money or net gain in revenue or anything like that. Rather, childcare is something that people just deserve. And if it costs a lot of money, oh well, that's what the government is here for, to protect our rights. One might also argue that children have a right to be cared for. So these are really two separate arguments. There's one argument that parents have a right to basically get assistance in their childcare. And there's a separate argument that children have a right to be cared for in a quality way. These arguments can be very, very persuasive. If you want to go in the rights route, one thing to keep an eye on is the distinction between positive rights and negative rights. A full exploration of that idea is beyond the scope of this discussion, but to explain it very quickly, a positive right is something that the government owes to people. If I claim that I have a positive right to food, I'm saying that the government or some other entity needs to give me food. On the other hand, a negative right is a right to have something not interfered with. So if I have a negative right to food, that means nobody is allowed to take my food, but nobody necessarily has to give me food either. If you are arguing that childcare is a right, you are probably arguing that it is a positive right, Because as the affirmative, you're going to argue that it should be provided by the state, right? And things that are provided by the state, generally speaking, are positive rights. Negative rights are protections from interference. So again, childcare might be a fundamental right, but there are two rights at play here. There's the right of children to be cared for, and the right of guardians, parents, families, to have assistance in the caring of their children. Now that we've looked at affirmative arguments, let's explore some negative arguments. Before we jump into them, I do want to point out, negating on this topic, I think, is going to be pretty difficult, right? Obviously, the negative has some advantages, right? Longer speeches, for example, and an ability to adapt to the affirmative. But if I'm being totally blunt, I just don't think there are as many persuasive arguments on the negative for this topic as there are arguments for the affirmative. So bear that in mind when you're conducting your research, and make sure that you carve out a good chunk of time to come up with some really strong negative arguments. It might not be as easy as you think. One approach to negating on this topic is to offer alternatives to a guarantee of universal childcare. For example, you might argue that we should simply extend tax or cash credits. We have those programs in place already. The infrastructure is already set up. Maybe we just want to make those programs more robust. You might also argue that we should have a non-universal program. For example, we should have guaranteed childcare, but limit it to families that are in a lower income bracket. You might also say that childcare is great, but it should be left to the states. This isn't a federal question. This isn't a question for the United States as a whole, but rather California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, Alaska, New York, right, Connecticut, Texas. These states should all individually determine how they want to provide childcare. We shouldn't have a one-size-fits-all program, and we shouldn't even have a federal program that creates a mandate that states provide childcare. Rather, state power is good, and states should be the ones who are making this decision. Now, these alternatives can be beneficial in that they allow the negative to co-opt a lot of the affirmative offense, right? If you're providing an alternative, you can say, hey, all that stuff in the affirmative case, I get those advantages too. I just access them with a different methodology. One thing to bear in mind is depending on where you're debating and who you're debating in front of, how you package these alternatives might differ. On the national circuit, counterplans are pretty universally accepted, but on local circuits and in front of more traditional or parent judges, you might not want to couch these arguments in terms of an explicit counterplan, but rather present these as alternatives and explain a reason why an alternative would be a reason not to affirm the resolution. Another argument that some people make is that quality matters and that any kind of guarantee of universal childcare will result in poor quality childcare. A government program could actually be counterproductive if the centers that these children are being sent to are problematic and are not, being run very well. Poor quality childcare could in turn have long-lasting negative effects. In other words, one way to conceptualize this topic is not just a question of how will childcare affect parents, but how will childcare affect the children? And if there's this kind of universal government program that's not getting a lot of funding, maybe the end result is that we send children to a bad situation. And that could have effects that last a lifetime for those children. What might be the most intuitive and common approach to this topic is to make arguments relating to capitalism and liberalism. Plenty of literature argues that the government should not interfere in the free market, that basically the government's job is just to protect the people within it from outside threats. But when it comes to goods like childcare or healthcare, the government shouldn't get involved. If something can be provided by the free market, by private enterprise, well, capitalist and liberalist ideologies say we should just leave it to the private market, that the government shouldn't get involved or it doesn't need to get involved. And this is an area, allegedly, where the government doesn't need to get involved. Authors argue that childcare should be provided by private business instead. So if you're having a little bit of trouble kind of getting a grasp on this ideology, I encourage you to try and find other examples of government interference or non-interference in the market, and think through those examples and ask yourself why the government should or shouldn't be involved. For example, internet. The internet is a good that is very important in today's society. It's very difficult to operate today without access to the internet. Now, does that mean that the government should go around replacing Comcast or Xfinity? Should the government be providing internet options? Should the government be guaranteeing internet options? Or should we just trust that private enterprise is going to provide the most beneficial and the cheapest option? Working through a couple of examples is a really good way to take these kind of abstract, philosophical, heady ideas like capitalism and liberalism and make them more concrete, accessible, and understandable. So let's just take a step back and think about what we've talked about today. We've taken this topic, the United States ought to guarantee universal childcare. We went through some definitions, we looked at the context of the topic so that we can ground it, and we looked at affirmative and negative arguments. It's a hotly contested issue, although, again, I do think negating on this topic will be more difficult than affirming. No matter what, though, it's going to be an awesome topic to debate, and I encourage you guys to have a ton of fun debating it. Thanks for watching, and good luck in all of your future competitions.